Good morning, everybody. My name is Suzanne Crocker from Chem, and welcome to our webinar today. You are in listen-only mode, so if you have any issues with the platform, could you please put your hand up or put a query into chat? If you have any questions to ask our presenter today, could you please put them in the questions section, and we will do questions and answers at the end. I just want to make you aware that this is the second in a whole range of webinars that we have prepared for you, and I'm just going to let you know some of the other subjects. So we've got tomorrow morning at 9 AM BST, getting the most from your Yellis and Alice data with Craig Wilson. We have got another one of that on Tuesday the 2nd of June at 9 AM BST. We have got Sue, who's with us today, is going to do another webinar on making the most of baseline data after a break in classroom teaching on Thursday the 4th of June at 9 AM BST. And again, she's going to do a repeat of that on Thursday the 4th of June at 4 PM BST. If you have some requests for webinars or subjects that you would like to know more about, perhaps you could let us know. I think it's a great opportunity at the moment to learn more about the use of data in schools and outcomes for students. So enough said about the webinars. I'd like to introduce Sue. We're really pleased to have her with us today. Sue has extensive experience in British international education, working across the whole age range. She has spent most of her career at the British School of Brussels, where she held various posts, including Deputy Head Curriculum, Head of Secondary and Vice Principal, and finally as Acting Principal, before moving to Argentina, where she became the Chems Consultant for Latin America. Her work has taken her to Peru, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina, and she has followed this by teaching and consultancy in Spain and China, and returned to school leadership in Qatar, Jordan, and Egypt. And she's now returned to consultancy. Sue has been working with Chem data for over 20 years and further developed her interest in assessment by completing a PG diploma in education, focusing on assessing and supporting children with specific learning difficulties. So welcome, Sue. Sue's going to talk about, does predictive data limit ambition or maximize potential? She's going to talk for about 25 to 30 minutes. Then we are going to have a poll during the presentation where we'd like some audience participation, and she will let you know when we're at the right place for that. And then we have plenty of time for your questions at the end. Okay, sorry, Sue. So really, really welcome. We're very pleased and very interested in what you've got to say.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone, wherever you are in the world. So we're going to explore whether predictive data limits ambition or maximizes potential. And I think as we go through the presentation, you will see it's very much on how you use it. So the areas we're going to explore are how does sharing predictive data with students affect their motivation? Does sharing baseline and predictive data with staff influence the strategies they use and affect final outcomes? And very controversially, what role does use of this data have in teachers and schools' performance management? So more than a decade ago, Carol Dweck put forward the idea that intelligence is not something that you're stuck with forever, because most people think that a person is either born smart, average, or dumb and stays that way for life. But new research shows that the brain's more like a muscle. It changes and gets stronger when you use it. So we want to have a look at why we continue setting and streaming. And I'm going to be asking you if you do set and stream in just a moment. And what's it based on? Do you base, if you do setting and streaming, do you base it on prior attainment? Do we use the standardized baseline data to do it? And are students in lower sets given the same opportunity to learn the material that those in higher sets are given? And does the setting and streaming affect a student's motivation? And I'll give you an example of that from my own daughter, who is now very much grown up. But she was at British School of Brussels, which is in general a very high achieving school. And she came home quite upset because she said she was only in a middle set for maths. And of course, I knew all the data we had on the setting. And I said, well, okay, so if you were in the top set, that would mean you were doing your GCSE a year early. And as you're in a middle set, that means you'll be predicted either an A star or an A. So it's fine. But she didn't like the number of her set. And even the youngest children are very much aware of where they've been placed. If they're in a primary school, they get put in groups called circles, squares, triangles, but they all know what that actually means. And does this affect their motivation? And so this is really why I want the poll very early on in this presentation is, what do you do in your schools if you do setting and streaming?
Is this the time for the poll then?
So this is the time for the poll.
Right, everybody. I'm just about to display it for you. If you give me a moment. Right, Sue, I don't think we can see your screen. You need to share your screen again.
Oh, right, okay. I don't know why my screen keeps doing that.
Okay, so no, can't see it. Right, everybody, whilst we're waiting, I'm going to launch the poll, if you wouldn't mind voting. So the question is, if your school sets children by ability, what data is used to reach a decision? Is it attainment data, baseline data, a combination of both, neither? And we're going to give you a couple of minutes to vote.
Okay, can I say, is my screen visible to you now?
I can't see your screen. However, that is because I've got the poll open.
Okay, because I think my screen is visible, but perhaps technically we can have some help with that if it isn't.
We will do in a second, yes.
Okay.
Okay, everybody, I am going to close the poll and then let's have a look. Okay, so we've got, if your school sets children by ability, what data is used to reach a decision? Is it, so we've got 13% say attainment data, 9% say baseline data, 73% say a combination of both, and 5% say neither.
Okay, that's really interesting. Well, I'm very pleased to hear that both sets of data are used. Because in many schools, it's prior attainment data, they have a test and that will decide the sets. So this is very useful that people are using the baseline data. Okay, let's just move on then.
Right, we still, oh, hold on. We do need to see your screen and we can't see your screen currently.
Well, I don't know why.
Oh, hold on, the audience say we can see the screen, so we're all right. That's perfect, we're all good.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you, audience.
Right then. I'm very sorry about the technical things. So, by setting and streaming, or by relying too much on attainment data, do we put barriers in the way of progression for some? So this will be very controversial at the moment. Are rigorous entry requirements in place for students to join A-level or IB courses in your school? Normally, in many schools, this is based on their GCSE results. And how will it change this year when exams have been cancelled? Will you and the students really trust the grades awarded? I'm very pleased I'm actually not in the school this year, because I can imagine the issues that people will have. So there'll be parents, students and staff all under great pressure, and people not really very happy with the grades. I saw some reports on BBC television talking about them being based on mock results. And I'm sure all of us know that mock results are notoriously bad as predictors, because many students don't really work for them. So it would be very interesting to see how those grades are arrived at. And I would argue that some of the baseline data is probably the most useful, but that wouldn't necessarily reward motivation. But we can come on to that another time. And will you as teachers, will your professional judgments carry more weight than the grades? Will influential parents be able to exert pressure for those grades to be increased? There's all sorts of issues this year. So if we look at prior attainment data, what does it really tell us? Does it tell us the level of intelligence of the child? If they get a great result, do we say, oh, they're really good, they're fantastic? Or does it look at the quality of teaching? There can be all sorts of things. I once came across a student in my school in Brussels, actually, who joined the school in year 6. And he came from a small African country where he hadn't had very much teaching at all. And he was put into a special educational needs group, where they quickly realized that he learned very quickly indeed. And he actually went on to get a place at Cambridge. So from year 6 to year 13, he made masses of progress, because he was a very bright boy, but he had great quality teaching. If he hadn't had that quality of teaching, I wonder what would have happened. What are the expectations of your school? Because this is also a very interesting one. When I went to work in Qatar, I'd appointed some staff who had come from the UK, and they came from schools which had severe discipline issues. And, so going into the classroom was very stressful every day. In the school in Qatar, the children were extremely well behaved, and they were quite docile, actually, especially the girls. And many of the teachers had lower expectations of them simply because they behaved well. They didn't realize they needed to get them to be much more actively engaged in their learning. So setting the school expectations is really important when looking at what the attainment is. Motivation and drive. Again, I can remember looking at predictive data from a student in a school in Spain. And if I was to look at her predicted grades, it would have been just as a single grade, it would have been just D's and E's. So if I'd given her D's and E's as predictions, I can imagine that would have been extremely demotivating. But she was extremely hardworking, and she went on to get 6 grade C's and above. So how we use, prior attainment data and how we affect motivation and drive is really important. And I will come on in just a moment to show how the baseline data can be used to increase that motivation. Of course, there are lots of things that we can't control. So family circumstances and health, they can really affect attainment. Currently at the moment, with many schools closed, then access to technology will be affecting students' progress. If you've got 5 children who are all trying to share one phone or one laptop to link into school, then it's very difficult for them compared to someone who's got all their own equipment. Social strata. How engaged are the parents with their children? What equipment do they have? I've already covered, but that will have an effect on the student. Self-esteem. If they're always getting very bad results, how can they have that feeling of self-respect and self-esteem, which can again affect motivation and drive? So there are so many factors other than just a score on a test that give us information about a student. Now, prior attainment can be a good predictor of future success, but it's not necessarily a measure of potential. It can be a case of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they keep doing badly, you don't expect them to do well, and it's a downward spiral. So, coming back to this growth mindset, what's the point of baseline testing? Can we really say a student has fulfilled his or her potential if all students can achieve highly, if the sky is the limit? And this comes to some of the work of Deborah Eyre. Professor Deborah Eyre has set up a program called High Performance Learning. And she says the first step towards progress in high performance learning is to shift in mindset towards expecting all students to be able to achieve highly. Of course, for some, the road is more complex than for others, and it may take longer, but is it just as achievable, at least in theory? I think it may take a while to take that on board. She's basically saying that everyone can get great grades eventually, at least in theory. So what does that mean in practice? How can we help those for whom the road is more complex to ensure that they get the best possible results? Does it mean giving them a different menu? If they're in a set which only limits their grades, is that fair? And why do we sometimes assume that students who are not academic are better suited to vocational practical courses, presumably of lower value? In the current climate, of course, what we assume now are the most valued key workers are very often not the ones which are highest paid. So we might need to be thinking of our values. So does sharing the baseline and predictive data with staff influence teaching strategies and affect the final outcomes? Well, using the baseline data for individuals, the baseline is just a snapshot. It gives you a measure of where a student is currently compared to others who have taken the test. So it's where they are currently, but of course that ability can be developed. It's not fixed for life. It isn't a certificate that you take home to show your parents. But it is very useful for teachers to look to see where any inconsistencies may indicate where extra support is needed, to give those students the extra steps, the extra help they need to accelerate learning. Now, I'm going to show you an example of an individual pupil record from a mid-years test. And I apologize for the green blob in the middle of the graph. I don't know why it's there. If you can see a green blob, some people can't. I mean, on my iPad, I get no green blob, but I get one on my computer. So as a result of the mid-years test, some of the scores you get are vocabulary ability, maths ability, and nonverbal. And those scores are shown in the table at the top. The standardized score, if you're not familiar with standardized scores, mean that the test has been standardized with 100 as the mean, so that would be your average score, with a standard deviation of 15. So anything between 85 and 115 is where you would find 68% of all the students. The Chem Centre has divided the students into 4 bands, A, B, C, and D, where A is the top 25%, B is the next 25%, and D is the bottom 25%. You've also got stay nines there, which is a link of, it means standard of 9, which takes the percentile ranks and divides them into 9 little groups. The percentile rank literally shows what percentage of students did better than the student whose data you're looking at, and what did worse. So in this student, vocabulary ability, that means only 14% of students would do better than this student, because his score was 86. But what's really unusual with this student is that their math score is so low. So if you don't like looking at numbers, the first thing you can just do is just look at the graph, and where you see areas which are inconsistent, that's when you need to ask them questions. So that student may have dyscalculia, have a problem with maths. And so at this point, you might send them off to your Senko for further assessment, because their overall score puts them kind of below average, but their scores are very, very diverse. And so you would need to look at the student who appears to be very talented when it comes to fluency with words, has a huge struggle when it comes to do with maths. So you immediately can target that student's needs and put in further assessments. So Midges is really very useful for that. You can also get cohort data. I'm sure at the beginning of every school year, you will have staff saying, oh, year 12 are really weak this year, or, oh, this year's year 7 is fantastic. I must say I've heard more of the former than the latter. But you do get a measure of cohort data from both Midges, Yellis, and the Alice IB tests, so that you can see what kind of results you might expect. It's unrealistic to expect your GCSE and A-level and IB results to improve year on year, because your cohorts will be different. What you can look for are trends, and that might affect the curriculum and also how you teach. So you might find that vocabulary scores are lower than other areas. Now that's really important, especially if you're working in a school with large numbers of students or a significant number of students for whom English is not their first language, because their exams are going to be in English. I assume they are if you're watching this presentation. And having the ability to converse and having the ability to get things down academically are quite different. The research has shown that it takes between 5 and 7 years for students to get academic fluency in a foreign language. So you would need to be looking at those vocabulary scores, maybe have a look at the math scores, see if they're in other areas. And how will the teaching and learning strategies you're using impact on this? So the kind of information you would get would be a cohort score like that. So this is actually real data from a school I once worked in. And it showed that 37% of the students were in the top 25% for vocabulary. And that in the B and C bands, we had 25% each, and only a small percentage in the D band. If your school was completely average, then all of the scores would go along that red dotted line. You would have 25% in each band. So on the surface, yeah, that looks pretty good. Then you look at the math graph and you think, oh, wow, that's quite a big difference compared to the vocabulary graph. You've got 62% of the students are in the top band for maths. Now you will also get a non-verbal graph, and often the non-verbal graph is very similar to the math graph. So immediately my thought would be, well, if we're going to improve the students' overall attainment, then we need to be working on their vocabulary. Now, how you do that is very much up to your individual school. Do you change the curriculum to put extra English lessons in? Do you have a drive across the whole school to improve literacy within each subject? So you've got literacy across the curriculum. So it's up to schools to come across to come up with their own solutions. But the thing about the data is that it helps you ask better questions. So the cohort data will give you a picture of your whole year group, and then the individual pupil data will tell you more about individual needs, so that you can deploy your resources much more effectively if you can ask better questions. Now, the predictive data. What's interesting is that you get a series of chances graphs which show that almost any result at GCSE, A-level and IB diploma can be achieved from almost any starting point. So it's a bit like this growth mindset. This data you have on the student is not a label for life, but it shows you maybe how difficult the road is for them going forward. Therefore, should we be using the expected grades as a prediction? In fact, should we ever be given a single grade as a prediction? And is there a difference between prediction, target, and estimated grade? I've been in loads of staff rooms where that's been discussed quite heatedly. So the prediction reports, this is an example of an IB prediction report, but they look the same whether they're for A-level or whether they're for GCSE, just they've got different numbers. And so what you get is chances of students getting certain grades based on their test result. So you've got the expected grade. So for example, this shows that there's a 40% chance of this student getting a grade 6 in IB higher level economics. But you will see that there is a probability of them achieving different grades. There's a 1% chance of them getting a 3. There's a 33% chance of them getting a 7. Now, I have found that these chances graphs can be extremely useful if you take the time to discuss them one-on-one with the students. And it has to be a student you know something about. So I have used this with students to motivate them, to talk about their chances that if they really work hard, they're going to get, that there's a good chance they can get the very highest grade. But I've also used it with students who are clearly underperforming, who are very bright but are not working hard, to point out to them that no matter how bright they are, there is still a chance they might not get the grades if they don't put some work into it. So although that there's a 40% chance of them getting a 6 based on their ability, there's also a pretty good chance they're going to get less than that unless they do some work. So I would never hand these out to students as a certificate to take home, but it is a very good point for discussion. And it's also a good point for discussion with parents whose expectations are greater than their child's current ability, and they're putting undue pressure on them. So those prediction reports can be extremely useful if they use one-to-one, discussing it with students with someone who really knows the student well and who knows all their circumstances. Of course, predictions for A-level and IB can be based on prior attainment as well, if available, and on the baseline test. And what I found is that if you've got access to both, it can be really powerful. For example, you might find that the student who has quite poor GCSE results and would be predicted poor A-level or IB results has done extremely well in the baseline test, suggesting that they underachieved at GCSE, and they could go on to do extremely well. On the other hand, you might find that someone might have kind of peaked at GCSE, and they're probably going to find the A-level and IB more of a struggle than they were anticipating, because their baseline test shows they might struggle. But still, you can use this as great motivation to talk it through with them. Sorry, I think I'm going on a little bit too long. I'll go a bit faster. The dilemma of target grades, well, does setting a target too high result in a feeling of failure if it's not reached? So I think we have to be realistic, and rather than having a target grade, we should look at the chances. A target should be a prediction plus a challenge. Motivation can be huge. So if you look at what you think a student is going to get and then add a little bit more and give that them as an aspirational target, then that could be useful. But should that be the highest rate of chances graph, or is that too much? You know the student, you can discuss that with them. But I don't think a single grade is a realistic target. And I think chances graphs should be discussed, as well as the behaviors and strategy which could influence the outcomes. So targets, what and how? Learning conversations with students should be motivational and practical. There's no point in telling them what they need to do. You can't just say work harder. You have to tell them how that they, how they can reach their target. And actually the same applies to senior leaders dealing with teachers. The conversation should be motivation and practical. That's their role as senior leaders. There's no point in a what without a how. So the data is only a single factor. You know so much more about a student, which could affect their academic progress. The learning conversation should to explore those barriers and how to overcome them. And really the same is true with teachers and their leaders. What if the teacher doesn't really know how? Well, we all have a responsibility to try and take responsibility for our own learning, but it's also school leaders' responsibilities to provide the right environment for teachers to develop. And I think it would be worth bearing in mind that it's quite clear in the Standards for Excellence for Head Teachers, which was published in 2015, and I will give you a chance to read that. And I think you will be pleased to say that it's their role to minimize unnecessary teacher workload that leaves room for high quality, continuous professional development for staff. And it's also their role to be up to date with educational research so that they do help schools improve by using the latest research. Right, estimated grades required for university entrance, especially this year. And teachers need to use research evidence to employ the best practices to improve learning outcomes. And it's up to senior and middle leaders to make this evidence readily available. Well, targets in teachers, it gets very difficult. Teachers are accountable, of course. But does your school have value-added targets for teachers? And is that reasonable given the sample size? If you're teaching a small class, then your value-added targets really aren't statistically valid. And how does your school deal with underperforming subjects? Saying improve doesn't work unless you give strategies on how that might be achieved. And just very rapidly, I'm going to go through some of the ways they can improve learning. And there's a few quotes there from some of the leaders in education, Gillen William, Robert Coe. So assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. Learning happens when we think hard about something, and learning is a change in long-term memory. So what is valuable learning? It happens when you think hard about something. It's transferable. And so teaching needs to address and promote learning, which is transferable. And assessment, this is not baseline assessment, of course, this is your assessments. It needs to be used as a powerful learning event which captures that transferred learning. And you can create those desirable difficulties by use of assessment. Professor Bjork has lots of very good videos you might want to look up. So which approaches work best? Now, some of these might surprise you. The research suggests that frequent short tests and quizzes very effective. That spacing and distributed learning is also very effective. In other words, don't do your end of unit test immediately after the end of the unit. So leave it about 3 or 4 weeks and then test them to find out what's actually been retained. Interleaved practice is better than mass practice. So, for example, if you're an English teacher and you're teaching Shakespeare and you're teaching poetry and you're teaching English grammar, it's best not to do a whole block just on Shakespeare, followed by poetry, followed by English grammar. What's better is if you interleave the lessons on all of those. They're doing 3 different things at the same time. And that actually is more effective. And train students to self-test themselves. All of these improve learning. And the ones which are least effective, although they can help when mastering the subject, but not for revision, are rereading and highlighting, summarizing, and using mnemonics and imagery. Many people use those as revision techniques, and they're found to be least effective. So, teaching students how to learn can accelerate growth by giving them the skills to develop themselves, and the predictive data, if used wisely, can be useful in kickstarting this process. So in conclusion, a single predicted grade may be demotivating and limit ambition, if not used properly. Predictive grade data in the form of chances graphs can be the start of a learning conversation to discuss the use of effective strategies to maximize potential. And using value-added data as part of performance management of staff should be used with caution. And the sky really is the limit. Your students can do extremely well. So thank you very much for your participation. And I will now hand back to Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Sue. Really interesting presentation. Now, I've got lots of questions. I might not be able to get through all of them in the next 20 minutes. However, what we will do is we will, as I said at the beginning, we will answer those questions in writing after the event. So my first question for you, Sue, is we've had several people bring this up, but how do you present data to students in a manageable way?
I would print out those chances graphs and sit down with them one-to-one. So that might be their form tutor, or it could be whatever the structure is in your school. Or it could be your year leader or your head of key stage, whatever. But to sit down with them and discuss those chances graphs. So look at their current attainment data, look at the chances graphs together, and then look at the barriers to learning and what they can do to improve. But there has to be a how to go with that target. They have to know some of those strategies. There's no point in just saying, well, if you work hard, you might get a better grade. Because unless they know how to work effectively, it isn't the same as working hard.
Thank you very, very much. Oh, this is an interesting one. Where is the research from? And they're talking about least effective rereading and highlighting, summarizing, using mnemonics and imagery.
Okay, there's a lot of research. One, I don't know whether I can give a plug to another group, but there is a group called Evidence-Based Education, and they run some excellent, so you can look them up, EBE, I think, Evidence-Based Education, and they run some very good online courses on assessment, as well as face-to-face courses, and they would give you all the research references. I can look them all up and put that in writing after the event. But there's a lot of research from that, and the Educational Schools Foundation, ESF, they've got lots of research as well.
Fantastic. I've got a good one here. With a student starting from a lower baseline, coming into A-level, for example, they might achieve a good grade, but not in 2 years. Would you say keeping them in for an extra year is advisable?
In most cases, repeating is not advisable because they just do the same thing over again. you know, and we don't have at the moment, we don't have like 3-year A-level or IB courses that space it out appropriately. I think, I mean, some students might need to repeat a year, but I think it's not usually very effective in my experience, and that they don't tend to improve much, and they can be demotivated because lots of school is social as well. And so if they feel like they've been kept back behind their friends, then they'd be demotivated. But I do feel that you can accelerate their learning, perhaps by reducing the number of subjects and giving them extra support. I think, you know, they might be overambitious in what they choose. One of the things that people might want to do at the beginning of A-levels this year is do the Alice test very early on and look at the predicted grade, because it isn't the same across all subjects, and make sure the students have chosen the subjects wisely. That will give them the best possible chance of success. I hope that answers it a bit.
That's great. Oh, I've got one here. So I share predictive data with pupils and parents with a regular update if they are achieving or exceeding this on reports color coded. Would you say this approach should not be used?
Yes, I think it's, well, I know it is used a lot, but I wouldn't advise it, because I do think we're just looking at single grades. And I do think it's the chances graphs that need to be looked at. I think it needs to be part of a conversation, and just giving color codes that someone is green gives them a false sense of security. If they're red, they can be very demotivated and just end up in a row with their parents at home. I think it needs to be a bit more nuanced than that.
When I was a leader and I was in charge of data and interventions, we always said we set smart targets. So what are you actually going to do in the next block of 6 to 12 weeks in order to improve, to get towards your target? But also we had lots of conversation with teachers as well, because if the teachers didn't incorporate into their teaching opportunities to learn skills that were lacking, then with the best will in the world, students don't know how to get the skills unless they get some input from the teachers.
Absolutely, it has to be a joint effort between the teacher and the student, an agreed strategy, and that's the saying the target. There's no point in the what without the how, and the how is really important in setting and giving those stepping stones for them to move on. But teachers need to be aware of how to do those stepping stones, and it's up to the senior leadership to give them those opportunities to learn how to develop stepping stones with students.
Indeed. Oh, I've got one about timing. That's a good one. When is the most effective time to share grades with pupils and assess if they're not on track to achieving at GCSE? Would you start with mid-years or wait for YELIS due to the possibility of a natural lull in year 9, for example? Perhaps we better clarify what year 9 is in an international context.
Okay, well, year 9 would be your 13 to 14-year-olds. Okay, so 13 to 14-year-olds. So basically, mid-years is very useful across the whole of Key Stage 3. That's years 7, 8, and 9. That's the 11 to 14s. Because it will give you those pupil profiles. I wouldn't particularly be thinking about GCSE predictions at that stage, even though it can give you that data. But the individual pupil profiles and also the cohort data, I think, is really powerful, because if you get things right in Key Stage 3, you've given them a really good base for going on to Key Stage 4 and 5. The YELIS, I would use at the beginning of year 10, and at the beginning of year 10, I would I would do the test very early on, and I would share the predictive data with them from the outset on a one-to-one meeting. So I think that would be a good time to share that data. And then, of course, whenever you do have attainment assessments, you can look at progress towards that target to see if they're on track. And if not, why not? And what interventions need to be put in place to ensure that they do get back on track. Aiming for an aspirational target, not just the middle prediction on the graph. Because you should be hoping that your school does better than other schools. That's the important thing if you're going to get the value added.
I've got a couple of questions about sixth form and A levels. So what is the best way to predict grades, especially AS and A level, as our predicted grades may affect learners' university applications?
Okay, well, at the beginning of year 12, I would suggest that you will have, I mean, if you do have GCSE results, then you will get some predictions based on GCSE results. But I think it's also useful for, at the very beginning of year 12, I mean, if you have a pre-start of term induction for year 12, that's the first year of your A-level course, then if they all did the ALICE test, then you would get two sets of predictions, one based on their baseline test and one based on their GCSEs. And from that, you will get the chances graphs, and you can set your targets with the students. But you wouldn't be predicting their A-level outcomes until the time they're applying for university, which would be a year later. So you would be able to look at that range of grades and look at their progress to date and comment on that in your reference to university. So you would, I think, to do it as early as possible, to set the scene, to show them that the highest grades are possible, even if their starting point a little bit challenged, and then help them move on by the interventions you put in place and their personal motivation.
I think this is a little bit off topic, but when would you start talking to the students about developing their profile for universities?
Again, I think it's something that you would have in the back of your mind right from the outset. So you will talk to them about their academic potential, but of course at that point you might also talk about other contributions they're going to make to the sixth form, which will be part of their university application. I don't think you can start it too early. I think you need to set your expectations of them very clearly from the very beginning of the 2-year course, and then keep having little milestone checks to see how they're doing in terms of those expectations across all aspects of their school life.
That's great, thank you. Right, I shall read this out slowly because there's quite a lot of information in this question. We have shared Yellow's chances graphs with students and parents and included a 0.5 uplift to include a challenge and for them to set their own target. Where this has been criticised is for a few students who are hard-working and hence achieving higher than the chances graphs might suggest. They find this demotivating. Other than by reviewing and adjusting individual graphs, do you have any suggestions about what we could do?
Okay, so I think when you share a chances graph with the student and you do it not by handing them a piece of paper, I would never do that. They would see the paper for the first time when sitting down with me or with someone. They would never just be given it and be told to come back for an appointment to discuss it, because there's all sorts of misinterpretations should go on. But the very first time they see it should be with someone who's going to explain it to them. I think you need to explain that the test is a snapshot on one day, and they could have had a bad day that day, and so the result is lower than you might expect. But you do have a whole range of grades, and you know that student, and you can say, well, it looks like you've only been predicted a D or an E, but I know you with your motivation, and I know you can get up there to an A if you're looking at still A stars and A's rather than 9 to 1. So the conversation can take place, but I do think you have to remember that this is a snapshot. It's not a label for life. And you can discuss it on that basis.
I've got an interesting question going the other way, where the predicted grades are good and the students become complacent. They don't study much for the exam, and the test grade comes out worse than the predicted grade. So how do you motivate the people who are complacent?
Well, I can picture the student I had this conversation with, and I can say he was called Waleed without giving anything more away. But he had incredibly high scores. I mean, he should have had A stars and everything. This was a few years back. But I also knew that he had a very active social life, if I can put it that way. And so I knew he wasn't doing any work. And so I did point out to him that even though his predictions were A stars, there was still a possibility he would get a U. And he didn't get his A stars, I have to sadly, but he did get some A's and B's, but he should have had A stars across the board. And so the conversation was had. I think it stopped him getting D's and E's because he did do some work in the end. But yes, you are dealing with different personalities, and there is I think the chances graphs show that even if you are very able, you can still come a cropper in the real exam unless you put some work in.
That's great, thank you. I'm just going to say to the audience, we've got a couple of questions with regard to the current situation for predicted grades using chem data and universities. We're not going to answer those during the webinar, but I will pass them on to my colleagues at Chem and Cambridge Assessment, and they will answer those afterwards.
Could I actually say that that's possibly what I'm doing in my next webinar?
Indeed, yes.
It will cover some of that as well.
Right, I've got time for 2 more questions. So in the current situation where we meet our students on a virtual platform, how can we predict our students' grades? Could you give us some ideas of evidence that we could use?
I think you can look at the chances graphs in relation to any attainment tests and your knowledge of those students. So look at those chances graphs as a predictor. It is very difficult, but you will have, before lockdown began, I'm sure you do have some assessment data in addition to that predictive data. So you can see how close they were to being on track or above that middle or below that middle. So it's a very difficult one this year, and I'm sure teachers are going to be under a lot of pressure, and head teachers. And I'm sure some students, some will feel relief and some will feel they've been hard done by. It's a very difficult one.
This is a good one. This is one I've always found difficult. When you share chances information with pupils, would you also share this with the parents?
Well, they're going to go home and say something to their parents anyway, but I would only share it with the parent in a one-to-one situation. I mean, I did share them with one parent I can think of who kept telling me that her daughter was absolutely brilliant and should get the highest grades. And yet the data didn't show that. And this poor child was under enormous pressure and was obviously showing signs of stress. And so I sat down with the parent and went through and saying how very good her daughter was and how she didn't need to work any harder, but she was not necessarily going to get the highest grades. So I would share it with parents at parents' evening with caution, and never hand it out. I would just say never hand it out as a piece of paper like a certificate. I think that's a really bad thing to do.
That's great. Talking about certificates, just to let everybody know that there is a certificate of attendance for this webinar, and they are emailed out approximately 24 hours after the webinar finishes. Just to remind people that there is a recording of this webinar, and it will be published on the Chem website, as well as questions and answers. I think we are going to have to finish there. We've got lots more questions, but we will answer them after the webinar, so we will be back in contact with you. So I just want to say thank you very, very much, Sue, for your time. Extremely interesting, and I'm really looking forward to the next webinar with you, which is next week.
Well, thank you very much to the audience for participating, and I hope you found some of it useful. Thank you.
And yes, thank you. It's definitely the best audience we've had so far. I've never seen so many questions and so many wonderful comments as well. So thank you very much, and take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.